So the trick to making a really cheap exotic wood cutting board is not to buy exotic lumber because that could be really expensive, but instead to buy what's called turning blanks. And these are usually used in lathes to make spindles and pens and things of that nature, but you can buy them in the right size to where they actually work out perfectly for cutting boards. I usually buy mine in the dimensions of 1.5 by 1.5 by 18 inches long. You could vary that size depending on whatever size cutting board you wanted to make. I buy a lot of my stuff from Bell Forest just because I don't have an exotic hardwood dealer near me. If you have an exotic hardwood dealer near you, you might try that option first. But I've been pretty happy with what I get from Bell Forest, so they're my preferred choice. The Purple Heart, for instance, right here is only $6 for that size of turning blank. So you get a couple of those and maybe mix it up with some maple or something else to offset the color, and you can have a pretty cheap exotic wood cutting board. So that's what I did. And once you've got a few of these turning blanks, you have to joint one side on all of them because they won't be flat enough to glue together. And then I plane the other side so I have two flat surfaces that are parallel to each other. And once you've done that, you can glue up the pieces together with the sides that you jointed and planed. I'm making two separate cutting boards here. And once they've been glued up, and I let mine set overnight, I stick the whole thing through my planer to get it perfectly flat. I made mine 12 inches wide by 18 inches long. So 12 inches being the max that I can put through my planer. And then I cut them into one. I made these 1.25, which ended up being a little bit too small for what I would have liked. So the second cutting board I made it 1.5 inches, which worked pretty well. Once I got down to the last bit, it was kind of hairy to stick a long piece in across the blade like that, so I just cut it against my fence like that. Then you lay them out, and you can flip the pieces alternating so that you mix up the pattern a bit. So that's what I'm going with. This one, I actually cut them a little bit shorter than I wanted to. I cut them about 1.25 inches thick. Usually you kind of want them to be 1.5 inches to 2 inches if you have, enough stock to do that. So for the ones that I cut a little bit shorter than I was planning, otherwise it would be an extremely big cutting board. But when it gets that kind of thin, when it gets around 1.25 inch, over time, they can warp a bit. So I'm gonna make two different cutting boards out of it, and hopefully that'll, subdue the warpage over time. It won't be as noticeable. And then this one's 1.5 inches. So I'll have three cutting boards basically. These will be little ones that you could use for whatever. And then once you've figured out your pattern, you go through and glue it up again. At this point, I realized I had messed up my pattern, so I fixed it. Luckily, I caught it. Otherwise, I would have had a part that didn't look right. And once they have dried overnight again, I just took a chisel to knock off the excess glue that had dried. This makes flattening it a little bit faster and easier. And then I flatten them through my drum sander. If you don't have a drum sander, you can just use a belt sander, a handheld version. I've done that before. It takes a lot longer generally, and you might not get it perfectly flat, but it can be done, and I've done it that way before. Then I squared up the edges on the table saw. I didn't get it quite perfect on the first pass, so I bumped it over a hair and did it again. I like having rounded corners on my cutting boards. You don't have to do this step if A, you don't have a disc sander, or B, you just like having squared edges, which is perfectly fine. Then it was time to start sanding. I just went over it with 120 grit on all of them first to get them kind of roughly smooth, if that even makes sense, roughly smooth. This is another step you don't have to do, but I put little finger holes on the side of the cutting board, so it makes it a little bit easier to pick up off of a countertop. But again, you don't have to do this. Then I took a round over bit and went around all the edges to put a nice round over on them. Again, not something you have to do. I'd probably recommend taking some sandpaper at least and knocking the sharp edge off, but this isn't a step you have to do. But I wanted to do it, so I did. And my router left some burn marks from the router bit, so I just went through with the 120 and cleaned up that round over to get rid of the burn marks. And then it was time to sand. I went from 120 to 220 and I finished with 400 grit. And then the last step was to take some mineral oil, which is food safe, and soak the cutting boards in it. Let it soak it up. You do this a couple of times over a day or two, and then the end result is you have a nice cutting board that you can use for a long time. Thanks for watching.